Mia Daniels, a poised and confident black woman in her early 30s, stepped out of a small neighborhood grocery store on a warm evening, cradling her infant son Noah in one arm and balancing a shopping bag in the other. She looked serene, her smooth brown skin glowing in the fading sunlight, her movements graceful despite the slight exhaustion in her posture. Her day had been long, filled with juggling work, household responsibilities, and caring for her baby. Yet there was something about this moment, walking back to her car with Noah snuggled against her shoulder, that felt like a brief reprieve from the chaos of life. The neighborhood was quiet, dotted with small shops and lined with trees whose leaves rustled faintly in the evening breeze. The air smelled faintly of baked bread from a nearby cafe, mingling with the faint scent of exhaust from passing cars. Mia adjusted the bag on her arm and smiled softly to herself as Noah babbled into her ear, his tiny hand gripping a lock of her hair. She glanced around the parking lot, which was mostly empty except for a few scattered vehicles. The hum of distant conversations and occasional honks from the main road filled the air, creating an almost tranquil backdrop to her walk. But tranquility has a way of being deceptive. Parked not far from where Mia's car sat was a police cruiser, its engine idling. Inside, Officer Rick Hunt, a white cop in his late 30s, slouched in his seat, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Rick was not having a good day. In fact, he wasn't having a good year. His career had plateaued long ago, and frustration had built up inside him like a pressure cooker. A string of minor reprimands, a messy divorce, and a lingering feeling of dissatisfaction with his job had left him restless and irritable. His shift that evening had been uneventful, which only fueled his need to assert some kind of authority before the night ended. When he saw Mia step out of the store, something about her immediately grabbed his attention. Rick straightened in his seat, narrowing his eyes as he watched her walk toward a sleek car parked a few spaces away. She didn't look like someone who belonged in this neighborhood, not to him, at least. The car, a late-model luxury SUV, only deepened his suspicion. In his mind, people like Mia were always up to something. He didn't need evidence or a valid reason to justify his assumptions. His biases filled in the gaps. His hand instinctively rested on the radio, but he didn't call in anything. Not yet. He wanted to handle this himself. He watched as Mia placed her shopping bag on the roof of the car, adjusted her hold on her baby, and reached into her pocket, likely for her keys. Something about the casual confidence in her movements irritated him. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was because she looked unbothered, unconcerned, as though she didn't even notice him sitting there, watching. Mia had noticed him, though. She had learned long ago to always be aware of her surroundings. Growing up as a black woman in America, she had been taught to stay vigilant, to recognize the subtle signs of trouble before it fully revealed itself. The presence of a police cruiser in this quiet parking lot wasn't exactly unusual, but the way it was positioned, the way the officer inside seemed to be studying her, set off a faint alarm in her mind. She didn't let it show. Her expression remained calm, her movements unhurried as she placed Noah into his car seat, carefully buckling him in. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, a weight pressing down on her back, but she refused to let it affect her. She had done nothing wrong, and there was no reason for her to feel uneasy. At least, that's what she told herself. Rick finally made his move. He swung the car door open and stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud. He adjusted his utility belt, his hand briefly brushing against the handle of his holstered gun as he approached Mia. His expression was unreadable, but his posture radiated authority. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice cutting through the stillness of the evening. Mia turned to face him, her brow furrowing slightly in confusion. "Yes, officer." "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. She instinctively stepped in front of the open car door, shielding Noah from view. Rick's eyes flicked to the car, then back to Mia. "Nice car you've got here," he said, his tone carrying a hint of something unspoken. "This your vehicle?" Mia's confusion deepened, but she kept her composure. "Yes, it is," she replied, her voice steady. "Is there an issue?" Rick took a step closer, crossing his arms as he studied her. "We've had reports of some suspicious activity in the area," he said vaguely. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Mia felt a spark of irritation flare in her chest, but she pushed it down. "I just finished shopping," she said simply. "I'm heading home now." Rick's eyes narrowed. He didn't like her tone, not because it was disrespectful, but because it wasn't deferential. There was no nervousness, no hesitation, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. "You live around here?" he pressed, his voice sharpening. Mia tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I don't see how that's relevant," she said, her voice calm but firm. Rick's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like her. "It's relevant if I say it's relevant," he snapped. "Step away from the car." Mia's heart rate quickened, but she didn't move. Her mind raced as she weighed her options. She knew how easily situations like this could spiral out of control, but she also knew her rights. "Officer, I'm not sure what you're looking for, but I have my groceries and my baby in the car," she said, her tone measured. "If you could explain why you're stopping me, I'd be happy to cooperate." Rick took another step closer, his hand hovering near his belt. "I'm not going to ask you again," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Step away from the car." The tension in the air was almost palpable. Mia's grip on the car door tightened as she glanced down at Noah, who had begun to squirm in his seat. Her mind screamed at her to de-escalate, to avoid provoking him. But every fiber of her being rebelled against the idea of submitting to his baseless authority. She drew a steadying breath and met his gaze head-on. "Officer, I'm not stepping away from my child," she said firmly. "If you have a legitimate reason to detain me, I'd like to hear it. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you let me go on my way." Rick's face hardened, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The faint sound of rustling leaves and distant traffic faded into the background as the two locked eyes, the tension between them a silent battle of wills. Noah let out a soft cry, breaking the silence and pulling Mia's attention back to her child. She reached down to soothe him, her movements deliberate and calm, but she could feel Rick's gaze boring into her, his frustration mounting with every passing second. In that moment, Mia knew this wasn't going to end quietly. Rick Hunt stood there, his stance rigid, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He wasn't used to this. Most people, when confronted by an officer, either backed down or made some attempt to appease his authority. But this woman, this Mia Daniels, wasn't backing down. Her calm composure only agitated him further. In his mind, her lack of fear, her refusal to submit, was nothing short of defiance. He told himself he was just doing his job, that he had every right to question her, but deep down, he knew this wasn't about protocol. It was personal now, a matter of proving his control. Mia, however, refused to let herself be intimidated. Her focus remained on protecting her son, both physically and emotionally. Noah's cries were soft now, more of a whimper as he sensed the rising tension around him. Mia placed a hand on the car door, her body a barrier between the officer and her child. She had been in situations like this before too many times, in fact, and she knew how quickly things could escalate. But she also knew she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. Fear would make her hesitate, and hesitation could be dangerous. "Mom, I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from the vehicle," Rick said, his voice sharp and impatient. He took another step closer, the distance between them now uncomfortably small. His hand hovered near his utility belt, fingers twitching as if deciding whether or not to reach for something. The gesture wasn't lost on Mia. She could see the tension in his jaw, the subtle clenching of his fists. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore, it had become a power struggle, and she was determined not to let him win. "I've already explained myself," Officer Mia replied, her voice steady but firm. "I've done nothing wrong. I have my groceries, my baby, and I'm heading home. If you have a valid reason to detain me, I'd like to hear it. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you let me leave." Her tone was polite but unyielding, and that only seemed to irritate Rick further. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at her, his eyes narrowing as though trying to find a crack in her composure, some sign of guilt or vulnerability he could exploit. But Mia gave him nothing. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until Rick finally broke it. "Pop the trunk," he demanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order, barked out with the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. Mia blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the abruptness of his demand. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. Rick gestured toward the rear of the vehicle with a sharp jerk of his head. "I said, pop the trunk. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind me taking a look." Mia felt her pulse quicken, her heart thudding against her ribcage. She knew she had nothing to hide, but the very idea of allowing this man to rifle through her belongings felt like a violation. More than that, it felt like a trap. She had seen stories like this play out before, how quickly an innocent situation could spiral out of control when assumptions and biases were involved. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. "Officer, I don't believe you have probable cause to search my vehicle," she said carefully. "If you think I've committed a crime, you're welcome to explain what that is. Otherwise, I'd like to go." Rick's face darkened, his frustration boiling over into barely concealed anger. "Are you refusing to comply?" he demanded, his voice rising. He stepped closer, his hand now fully resting on the butt of his gun. The subtle threat was unmistakable. Mia felt her stomach churn, but she stood her ground. "I'm not refusing anything, officer," she replied evenly. "I'm simply asking you to follow the law. If you believe I've committed a crime, please tell me what it is. Otherwise, I don't see any reason for this stop to continue." Rick's patience snapped. "Step back from the car," he barked, his voice echoing through the quiet parking lot. He reached out, grabbing Mia's arm in an attempt to physically move her away from the vehicle. The suddenness of his action startled her, and she instinctively pulled back, her other arm wrapping protectively around Noah. The baby began to cry again, his soft whimpers escalating into frightened wails as the tension around him reached a breaking point. "Don't touch me," Mia exclaimed, her voice sharp and filled with a mixture of fear and anger. She stepped back, pulling her arm free from his grip. The force of her movement caused her grocery bag to slip from the roof of the car, spilling its contents onto the ground. A carton of milk burst open upon impact, its white liquid pooling around the scattered produce. The sight of the mess only seemed to further enrage Rick. "You're resisting," he shouted, his hand moving to his radio. "I'm calling this in." Mia's mind raced. She could see where this was heading, and she knew she needed to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled any further out of control. But how could she do that when the officer seemed intent on escalating it himself? "Officer, please," she said, her voice trembling slightly but still steady enough to convey her determination. I have a child here. I don't want this to get out of hand. Let's take a step back and talk this through." Rick didn't seem to hear her. His focus had narrowed, his world reduced to the perceived threat in front of him. His radio crackled to life as he called for backup, his voice clipped and professional, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Requesting additional units at my location," he said tersely. "Possible resistance. Suspect refusing to comply." Mia's stomach dropped. Backup meant more officers, more tension, more chances for things to go wrong. She glanced around the parking lot, hoping to see anyone who might step in and help defuse the situation. But the lot was eerily empty, the fading light of day casting long shadows that only added to the sense of isolation. She was on her own, and she knew it. "Mom, step back now, or I will have no choice but to detain you," Rick said, his tone icy and final. Mia met his gaze, her jaw tightening. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand that he leave her alone. But she knew that any sign of weakness, any hint of aggression, would only give him an excuse to escalate further. So instead, she took a deep breath and did the only thing she could think of. She reached into a pocket and pulled out her phone. Rick's eyes narrowed as he watched her unlock the screen, his hand tightening on the grip of his gun. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Mia didn't answer. Instead, she tapped the screen a few times, her fingers trembling as she typed out a message. She knew she had mere seconds before the situation exploded, and she had to make them count. The message was brief, just a few words sent to the one person she knew would come for her no matter what. Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked up at Rick. "I've done nothing wrong," she said quietly, "and you're going to regret this." The tension between them was electric, the air crackling with unspoken threats and barely restrained emotion. Mia didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going down without a fight. Rick's grip on the radio tightened as he kept his eyes fixed on Mia, his frustration now boiling over into outright hostility. The soft cries of Noah pierced the tense silence, but they seemed to bounce off Rick without registering. His focus was singular and unrelenting. He was determined to assert control over the situation, no matter the cost. To him, Mia's calm defiance wasn't strength. It was a direct challenge to his authority. Every word she had spoken, every composed response, only added fuel to his simmering anger. He could feel his control over the encounter slipping, and it made his blood burn. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared back at him. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, but she refused to show fear. She could feel Noah squirming in his car seat behind her, his cries growing louder as the tension thickened. She wanted nothing more than to shield him from this chaos, to wrap him in her arms and make him feel safe. But her priority right now was to hold her ground, to make sure that Rick didn't see an opening to escalate further. She'd seen what happened when people panicked in situations like this. Panic led to mistakes, and mistakes led to tragedy. She couldn't afford that, not for herself and certainly not for Noah. Rick took another step forward, his body now just a few feet from hers. The way he moved, slow and deliberate, reminded Mia of a predator closing in on its prey. "Mom," he said, his voice low and tight, "I'm not going to tell you again. Step away from the vehicle. Now." His hand was still on the butt of his gun, the gesture not quite a threat but unmistakably meant to intimidate. The unspoken warning in his tone was clear: comply, or things will get worse. Mia straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Officer," she replied evenly, "I've told you already. I'm not leaving my child. If you're going to detain me, you'll need to explain your reasons. Otherwise, I suggest we both take a moment to step back and calm down." Her voice was steady, but she could feel her nerves fraying at the edges. She had no idea how much longer she could keep this up. Rick's eyes narrowed, the faint lines around them deepening as his jaw clenched. The word calm grated against him like nails on a chalkboard. He didn't need her to tell him how to handle the situation. He was the one in charge here, not her. He reached out suddenly, his hand grabbing for her wrist in a move so swift that Mia barely had time to react. Instinct took over, and she yanked her arm back with a sharp motion, breaking his grasp. The force of her movement startled them both, and for a brief second, the air between them froze. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Rick snapped, his voice rising in pitch. He took another step forward, his body language radiating aggression. "Are you resisting me?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. "I'm protecting myself," Mia shot back, her voice firm but not loud. She refused to let him twist the narrative, to paint her as the aggressor. "And you need to stop touching me. I haven't done anything wrong." Rick's face flushed red, his frustration and embarrassment bubbling to the surface. He was losing control of the encounter, and he knew it. Every move she made, every calm and calculated response, only made him look more unreasonable. The few scattered onlookers in the parking lot had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold, their gazes sharp and curious. Rick felt their eyes on him, and it only added to his growing sense of humiliation. "You're making a mistake," he growled, his voice dripping with barely contained rage. "You think you can just ignore a lawful order and walk away? Not on my watch." Without waiting for a response, he reached for his handcuffs, the metallic sound of them snapping open sending a shiver down Mia's spine. "Don't you dare," Mia warned, her tone sharper now. She stepped back, her body positioned squarely in front of the open car door. The movement caused her to bump into Noah's car seat, and she reached behind her to steady it. Her son's cries had turned into full-fledged wails, his tiny face red and scrunched up in distress. The sound cut through Mia like a knife, but she forced herself to stay focused. "I'm asking you again to step back," she said, her voice firm. "There's a baby here. This is unnecessary." Rick ignored her completely. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched to grab her arm again, but this time Mia was ready. She twisted to the side, using her body to block his path. The movement was small but deliberate, and it threw Rick off balance. He stumbled slightly, his foot slipping on the spilled milk at their feet. He recovered quickly, his face twisting into a mask of fury. "You're resisting arrest," he barked, his voice booming. "I'm giving you one last chance to comply, or I'll take you down myself." Mia's patience snapped. "Arrest me for what?" she demanded, her voice rising for the first time. "For protecting my child. For standing up to your baseless harassment. Tell me, officer, what exactly am I being arrested for?" Her words came out in a rush, fueled by a potent mix of anger and fear. She was done playing his game. Rick faltered, the question catching him off guard. He hadn't expected her to fight back, not like this. In his mind, people like her were supposed to fall in line, to obey without question. But Mia wasn't obeying. She wasn't cowering. She was standing her ground, and it was throwing him off balance. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening. Before Rick could recover, another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What the hell is going on here?" The question came from across the parking lot, loud and authoritative. Both Mia and Rick turned toward the source of the voice, their heads snapping in unison. A man was striding toward them, his tailored suit and polished shoes an odd contrast to the chaos of the scene. His expression was hard, his dark eyes fixed squarely on Rick. The man exuded confidence and power, his presence immediately commanding attention. Mia felt a wave of relief wash over her as she recognized him. "Jason," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason Daniels, her husband, closed the distance between them in a matter of seconds. He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze flicking between Mia, Rick, and the crying baby in the car seat. His jaw tightened as he took in the scene, his mind racing to piece together what had happened. His wife's flushed face, the scattered groceries on the ground, the officer's aggressive stance it didn't take him long to understand. "Who are you?" Rick demanded, his tone sharp and defensive. He straightened his posture, trying to reassert his authority. Jason's eyes locked onto him, cold and unyielding. "I'm her husband," he said, his voice measured and deliberate. "And I'd like to know why you're harassing my wife and child." His tone left no room for argument, each word carefully chosen to convey both anger and control. Rick bristled at the challenge. "This is none of your business," he snapped. "Step back." Jason didn't move. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze boring into Rick's. "You're manhandling a mother in front of her infant," he said evenly. "You've made it my business." There was an edge to his voice now, a quiet menace that made even Rick hesitate. Mia took a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time since the encounter began. She could feel the tide beginning to turn, the balance of power shifting ever so slightly in their favor. But she knew it wasn't over yet. Rick was like a cornered animal now, his pride wounded, his control slipping away. And a cornered animal was dangerous. Rick's hand twitched near his gun, and Jason's eyes flicked downward, tracking the movement. "I wouldn't," Jason said quietly, his voice dropping to a low warning. "You're already in over your head. Don't make it worse." For a moment it seemed like Rick might ignore the warning, that he might lash out in a desperate attempt to regain control. But something in Jason's tone gave him pause. It was the voice of someone who wasn't bluffing, someone who knew exactly how far he could push. Rick hesitated, his fingers curling into a fist at his side instead of reaching for his weapon. The standoff stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, with a sharp exhale, Rick finally took a step back. "Fine," he spat, his voice thick with frustration. "But this isn't over." Jason's expression didn't waver. "Oh, it's over," he said coolly, "and you're going to regret it." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken promise. The confrontation wasn't finished, not yet. But for the first time, Mia felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. And with Jason by her side, she knew they had a fighting chance. Jason Daniels stood firm, his sharp gaze fixed on Rick, who now looked as though he was caught between two choices, doubling down on his actions or retreating entirely. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating, and Mia could feel her pulse hammering in her ears. Noah's cries had quieted to soft, intermittent whimpers as he sensed the change in the atmosphere. Mia kept a protective hand on the car door, her body still shielding her son as her husband positioned himself between her and Rick. Rick's jaw tightened as he weighed his options. His ego demanded that he maintain his authority, to show these people, this man, that he was in control. But the way Jason looked at him, with calm, steely confidence, made him hesitate. There was something about the man's demeanor, the way he carried himself, that suggested this wasn't someone to be underestimated. Rick's instincts screamed at him to assert himself, but another voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning, "Tread carefully." "I don't need to explain myself to you," Rick said finally, his tone defensive. His hand hovered near his belt, where his gun remained holstered, but he didn't move to draw it. He glanced briefly at Mia, then back at Jason. "Your wife was resisting a lawful order. I had every right to detain her." Jason's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "A lawful order?" he repeated, his voice dangerously calm. And what exactly was lawful about grabbing a mother with a crying baby in her arms? Or about demanding she step away from her own car without any probable cause? He took a slow step closer to Rick, his height and presence casting a long shadow over the officer. "You had no right to touch her, and you certainly have no right to escalate this any further." Rick felt a surge of anger bubble up inside him, but he kept it in check. The man in front of him wasn't just a concerned husband, there was something more. He could see it in the man's posture, in the precision of his words. This wasn't someone acting on emotion alone, this was someone who knew the law, someone who understood exactly how far Rick could go before crossing the line. And that knowledge made Rick uneasy. "Look, I don't have time for this," Rick snapped, trying to reassert his authority. "I've got backup on the way, and when they get here, we'll settle this properly. But until then, I suggest you step back and let me do my job." Jason didn't flinch. If anything, his expression grew colder. "Your backup?" he said, his voice dropping a notch. "Good. I'd like to see how you explain this to them." He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, and Rick tensed, his hand tightening on the grip of his gun. But Jason didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he withdrew a slim leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal an official badge and ID. Rick's eyes darted to the badge, and his stomach sank. Jason didn't give him time to process the revelation. "Jason Daniels," he said evenly. "Assistant U.S. Attorney. And you, Officer Hunt, are about 2 steps away from turning this into a federal case." His voice was calm, almost too calm, but the weight of his words hit Rick like a freight train. Mia let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Jason's revelation didn't surprise her. She knew her husband well enough to expect him to take control of the situation. But seeing the impact it had on Rick, the way the officer's bravado seemed to falter, brought her a flicker of relief. She glanced at Jason, her eyes meeting his briefly, and in that moment she felt a renewed sense of hope. They weren't powerless. Not with Jason here. Rick's face turned an angry shade of red. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jason didn't give him the chance. "You've already made a mess of this, officer," Jason continued, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Let me make one thing very clear. You have no grounds to detain my wife, and you certainly have no grounds to search her vehicle. Every action you've taken tonight has been an abuse of your authority, and I will make sure that is reflected in my report." Rick's hand dropped from his belt, his bravado slipping further as he realized the precarious position he was in. His eyes flicked to Mia, then back to Jason, his mind racing to find an exit strategy. The arrival of backup couldn't come soon enough, but even that might not save him now. He hadn't expected this, a federal prosecutor with a badge and an icy calm demeanor that made it clear he wasn't bluffing. Jason took another step forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Now," he said, "you can stand here and wait for your backup to arrive, or you can walk away. But if you choose to stay, understand that everything you've done tonight is already on record, and I'll make sure it doesn't get swept under the rug." Rick felt a bead of sweat roll down the back of his neck. The confidence he'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. He'd overplayed his hand and now he was cornered. But his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "I was just following protocol," he muttered, his tone defensive. She looked suspicious. "I had to check." Jason's expression didn't change. "Suspicious?" he echoed, his voice laced with incredulity. "A woman carrying groceries and a baby? That's your definition of suspicious? You think that's going to hold up in court?" He shook his head, his disdain evident. "You're lucky I'm giving you the chance to walk away from this. Because if you don't, I guarantee you'll be the one facing charges." Rick clenched his fists at his sides, his face a mask of barely contained rage. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but he knew he was outmatched. The weight of his mistakes bore down on him, and the presence of Jason's badge made it clear that this wasn't a battle he could win. He took a step back, his movements stiff and reluctant, but he didn't say anything. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tense silence, the wailing growing louder as backup approached. Rick's shoulders sagged slightly in relief, though it was short-lived. Jason didn't move, his stance unyielding as he waited for the reinforcements to arrive. Mia remained by the car, her hand still on the door, her gaze fixed on her husband. She trusted him to handle this, to protect their family. But the presence of additional officers added a new layer of uncertainty, and her nerves were on edge. 2 patrol cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing as they came to a stop nearby. 3 officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a sergeant with a weathered face and a calm demeanor, approached Rick. "What's going on here, Hunt?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. Rick hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the right words. Before he could respond, Jason stepped forward. "Sergeant," he said, his voice cutting through the awkward silence. "Jason Daniels, Assistant U.S. Attorney, I'd like to file a formal complaint against Officer Hunt for harassment, unlawful detention, and attempted escalation without cause." The sergeant's eyes widened slightly as he took in Jason's badge and the sharp authority in his tone. He glanced at Rick, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "Is that so?" the sergeant said, his tone neutral but laced with curiosity. "Mind explaining what happened here?" Jason didn't hesitate. He laid out the events with precise detail, his words clear and concise. He described how Rick had approached Mia without cause, how he tried to detain her and search her vehicle without justification, and how he'd ignored her rights at every turn. The sergeant listened carefully, his expression unreadable. But Mia could see the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his eyes narrowed slightly as Jason spoke. He wasn't pleased with what he was hearing. When Jason finished, the sergeant turned to Rick, his gaze hard. "Is that true, Hunt?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge of warning. Rick stammered, his confidence completely gone. I thought she looked suspicious," he said weakly. "I was just doing my job." The sergeant's jaw tightened, and he let out a slow breath. "We'll talk about this back at the station," he said curtly. "For now, step aside." Rick opened his mouth to protest but thought better of it. He stepped back, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation as the sergeant turned back to Jason. "I'll make sure this is handled appropriately," the sergeant said, his tone professional. "You have my word." Jason nodded, his expression still cold. "I'll be following up," he said simply. The implication was clear, this wasn't over. As the officers began to disperse, Rick slunk away toward his patrol car, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Mia finally allowed herself to relax, her hand dropping from the car door as she turned to Jason. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Jason reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's over now," he said, his tone gentle. "You're safe." Mia nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But even as she held Noah close, relief flooding through her, she couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The encounter might be over, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. And she knew, deep down, that this wasn't the last battle they would face. But for now, they were together, and that was enough. The parking lot was bathed in the pulsating glow of red and blue lights as the additional officers who had arrived began moving into position. The tension in the air had not dissipated with Rick stepping aside, it had only thickened, spreading like a toxic fog as Jason Daniels stood his ground, his face an impenetrable mask of calm fury. Mia, still leaning against the car to shield Noah, watched with wary eyes as her husband faced off against not only Rick, but now the broader institution that Rick represented. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her, though she refused to let it show. She couldn't afford to appear vulnerable now, not when things still felt so precarious. Rick, humiliated by the sergeant's initial response, had retreated to the side with clenched fists, his lips pressed into a thin line. But the fight wasn't out of him yet. The arrival of his colleagues had reinvigorated him, and the shame of being publicly reprimanded only seemed to fuel his simmering anger. He knew he had crossed lines, but he was also counting on the unspoken camaraderie of his fellow officers to shield him. There was always a way to spin the story, to reframe events in a way that made him the aggrieved party, the hero just trying to do his job in the face of disrespect and defiance. And with Jason Daniels so openly challenging him, Rick saw an opportunity to reclaim some of the power he felt he'd lost. Sergeant Miller, the senior officer on the scene, had turned his attention back to Jason after addressing Rick's initial missteps. Miller was a seasoned cop, the kind of man who had seen it all over his decades on the force. He carried himself with an air of authority that was quieter but no less commanding than Rick's bluster. Yet even Miller couldn't hide the subtle tension in his posture as he spoke to Jason. The assistant U.S. attorney's presence wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Miller knew the kind of scrutiny that could come with a federal prosecutor's involvement, and he was already calculating the potential fallout from the situation. Mr. Daniels, Miller began, his tone measured and diplomatic. I understand your concerns, and I assure you we'll conduct a thorough review of Officer Hunt's actions here tonight. But I have to ask that we all take a step back and allow cooler heads to prevail. There's no need for this to escalate further. Jason's dark eyes fixed on Miller, unblinking. His expression didn't soften, and his voice was as steady as ever when he replied, Sergeant, with all due respect, this situation escalated the moment your officer decided to harass my wife without cause. It escalated when he ignored her rights and attempted to detain her unlawfully. And it escalated when he laid his hands on her while she was holding our infant son. So forgive me if I don't share your optimism about letting cooler heads prevail. Miller's jaw tightened slightly, but he held his composure. I hear you, he said carefully. And as I said, this will be addressed. But right now, my priority is ensuring that everyone here is safe and that this situation doesn't get out of hand. Jason took a deliberate step closer to Miller, his presence almost overwhelming despite the lack of aggression in his movements. The only person putting anyone at risk here, he said, his voice low and pointed, is your officer. My wife and my son are not threats. They were never threats. The threat came from Hunt, and your refusal to acknowledge that only emboldens him. Miller's calm facade cracked for a brief moment, a flicker of frustration passing across his face. He was used to handling difficult situations, but this wasn't a typical confrontation. Jason Daniels wasn't an angry civilian making baseless accusations. He was a federal prosecutor who knew the law inside and out, and every word he spoke carried the weight of someone who could back up his claims with action. Miller glanced toward Rick, who was still standing nearby, his body language a mixture of defiance and unease. The sergeant had no illusions about Rick's temperament. He'd dealt with his subordinates' aggressive tendencies before, but publicly undermining one of his own officers in front of a federal prosecutor was a dangerous game. Before Miller could respond, Rick stepped forward, his voice cutting through the conversation like a jagged blade. "I was doing my job," he said, his tone defensive but laced with anger. "She was acting suspicious, and I had every right to question her. If she'd just cooperated, none of this would have happened." Jason turned his gaze on Rick, his expression unchanging but his voice sharp enough to draw blood. "Cooperated with what, exactly?" he demanded. "Your baseless accusations? Your illegal demands? Or perhaps the way you grabbed her while she was holding a baby? Tell me, Officer Hunt, which part of this was her responsibility to cooperate with?" Rick bristled, his face turning red as he struggled to come up with a response. His eyes darted toward Miller, silently pleading for backup, but the sergeant remained silent. Jason took another step forward, closing the gap between himself and Rick. "You're a disgrace to that badge," he said, his voice quiet but seething with contempt. "And if you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you walk away from this without consequences, you're even more delusional than I thought." Rick's fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with barely restrained fury. He felt the walls closing in around him, the weight of his actions pressing down like a vice. But instead of backing down, he let his anger take control. "You think you can walk in here and lecture me?" He spat, his voice rising. "You don't know what it's like out here. You don't know the kind of crap we deal with every day. People like you sit in your cushy offices and think you know better, but you don't." Jason didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "What I know," he said, his tone icy, "is that you let your biases dictate your actions. What I know is that you saw a black woman in a nice car and decided she didn't belong. What I know is that you endangered my family because of your ego. And what I know is that you're going to answer for every single one of those decisions." Rick took a step closer, his posture aggressive, but Miller stepped between them before things could escalate further. "That's enough," the sergeant said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned to Rick, his eyes hard. "Go wait by your car, now." For a moment it seemed like Rick might refuse. His jaw clenched, his chest heaving with barely suppressed rage. But the weight of Miller's authority finally broke through, and with a sharp exhale, Rick turned on his heel and stalked off. His retreat was anything but graceful, and the tension in his body radiated anger and humiliation. Mia watched him go, her grip on the car door tightening as she fought to steady her breathing. Jason placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her as the chaos around them slowly began to settle. Miller turned back to Jason, his expression unreadable. "I'll handle him," he said simply. "And you have my word that this will be investigated thoroughly." Jason nodded, though his face remained stern. "See that it is," he said. "Because if it isn't, I'll take it higher. And believe me, Sergeant, you don't want that." Miller nodded once, his jaw tight. He didn't doubt for a second that Jason meant every word. The sergeant gestured to the other officers, signaling for them to disperse. The flashing lights of the patrol cars began to fade as the vehicles pulled away one by one, leaving the parking lot bathed in an eerie quiet. Rick lingered by his car, his posture rigid, but he didn't make any move to approach them again. As the last patrol car pulled out of sight, Jason turned to Mia, his expression softening for the first time since the confrontation began. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Mia nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "I'm fine," she said quietly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "Noah's okay too." Jason glanced at their son, who had fallen into a fitful sleep in his car seat. The sight of the infant's tiny face, peaceful despite the chaos, brought a wave of relief crashing over him. He reached out to cup Mia's face, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." But even as the words left his mouth, Jason knew they weren't entirely true. The confrontation with Rick might be over, but the deeper issues that had led to it were far from resolved. He could see it in Mia's eyes, the way her shoulders were still tense, the way her gaze lingered on the spot where Rick had stood. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that allowed men like Rick to operate with impunity, a system that had failed them time and time again. Jason took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. And as he helped Mia into the car, his mind was already racing, plotting the next steps in their fight for justice. The parking lot was silent now, the flashing police lights gone, leaving behind only the muted glow of streetlights and the distant hum of passing traffic. Yet the tension lingered heavy and suffocating, as if the very air refused to let go of the confrontation that had unfolded moments ago. Mia sat in the passenger seat of their car, her hands gripping the edges of the seat as she stared at the dashboard, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Noah had finally drifted into a restless sleep in the back seat, his tiny chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, a stark contrast to the turmoil still churning in his parents' hearts. Jason stood just outside the car, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in a low, clipped tone. His words were deliberate, precise, each one chosen with the weight of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He had made the call the moment Sergeant Miller left, dialing the direct line of a senior official in the district attorney's office. Jason's tone conveyed not just anger, but something deeper, a quiet, cold determination that sent chills down the spine of anyone who listened. He wasn't just reporting what had happened, he was preparing for war. Mia watched her husband through the window, her chest tightening as she took in the hard set of his jaw, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched at his side. She had seen him like this before during high-stakes cases where lives were on the line and every decision carried monumental consequences. But this was different. This wasn't just about a case. This was personal. Jason wasn't fighting for a client this time. He was fighting for his family, for her, for their son. And the weight of that realization made her feel both grateful and unbearably sad. Jason ended the call with a sharp tap of the screen and slipped his phone into his pocket. He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling as he steadied himself, before opening the driver's side door and sliding into the seat. He glanced at Mia, his expression softening for a moment as he reached over to place a reassuring hand on her knee. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, gentler. Mia nodded, though her grip on the seat didn't loosen. "I think so," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound composed. She glanced over her shoulder at Noah, her gaze lingering on his sleeping form. I can't stop thinking about what could have happened. If you hadn't shown up." Jason's jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek twitching as he followed her gaze to their son. "It didn't," he said firmly. "I was there. You're both safe now." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't enough. Safety wasn't a guarantee, not for them. Not in a world where encounters like this could happen at any moment without warning. Mia turned back to him, her eyes searching his face. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a simple question, but the weight it carried was anything but. She wasn't just asking about Rick or the incident in the parking lot. She was asking about the future, about the world they were raising Noah in, about the fight they both knew they couldn't avoid. Jason met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment before he nodded slowly. "Now," he said, his voice steady. We make sure this never happens again. Not to us. Not to anyone. The drive home was quiet, the only sounds coming from the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of Noah shifting in his sleep. Mia stared out the window, her mind replaying the events of the night over and over again, each detail seared into her memory. Jason's words echoed in her head, a promise and a challenge all at once. She didn't know what never again looked like, but she knew Jason wouldn't stop until he found a way to make it real. When they arrived home, Jason carried Noah upstairs while Mia lingered in the living room, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't taken a single sip from. She felt drained, like every ounce of energy had been wrung out of her, leaving only the weight of her thoughts behind. The silence of the house was almost oppressive, a stark contrast to the chaos of the parking lot. But even here, in the supposed safety of their home, she couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that had taken root in her chest. Jason returned a few minutes later, his steps slow and deliberate as he joined her on the couch. He didn't say anything at first, just reached for her hand and held it in his own, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. For a while they sat like that, the silence between them heavy but not unwelcome. It was a silence that spoke of shared pain, of unspoken fears and unbreakable resolve. "I spoke to the DA," Jason said finally, his voice breaking the stillness. "They're taking this seriously. Rick's actions will be investigated, and I'll make sure the department knows they can't sweep this under the rug." "This isn't over." Mia nodded, her eyes fixed on their intertwined hands. "And if they try?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. There was no need to elaborate. Jason understood exactly what she meant. "They won't get the chance," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a promise. "I'll make sure of it." Mia looked up at him then, her eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I know you will," she said softly. But even as she said the words, she couldn't help but wonder how many more battles like this they would have to fight. How many more times they would have to defend their right to simply exist without fear, without suspicion, without hostility. The thought was exhausting, and yet she knew there was no other choice. This was the reality they lived in, and until something changed, they would have to keep fighting. The next morning, Jason was up early, his phone buzzing with calls and messages as the aftermath of the previous night began to unfold. Mia watched him from the kitchen, her hands busy with breakfast as she listened to his measured, authoritative tone. He was relentless, methodical, his words cutting through excuses and deflections with the precision of a scalpel. By the time he ended the last call, there was no doubt in her mind that he had already set the wheels in motion. When he joined her at the table, his expression was a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "I've scheduled a meeting with the department," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "The DA's office is backing me on this. We're going to make sure Rick is held accountable." Mia nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. "What about Sergeant Miller?" she asked. "He didn't do anything to stop Rick. He only acted when he got involved." Jason's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening. "Miller will face scrutiny too," he said. "Everyone involved will. This isn't just about one bad cop, it's about a culture that allows this to happen." Mia reached across the table to take his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you," she said simply. It wasn't enough to convey everything she felt, her gratitude, her anger, her hope, but it was all she could manage in that moment. Jason squeezed her hand in return, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "This is what we do. This is who we are." The words hung between them, a reminder of the strength they drew from each other and the love that anchored them through even the darkest moments. They knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but as they sat there, united in purpose, they felt a spark of something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The aftermath of the incident unfolded in waves, each revelation adding another layer to the complex web of consequences. Jason Daniels, true to his word, had turned the parking lot confrontation into a battle not just for accountability, but for systemic change. Within days, the story had reached the ears of those who mattered most, both within the police department and in the broader circles of justice. But for Mia, the real aftermath was quieter, unfolding within the walls of their home as she tried to process what had happened and prepare for what was to come. It had been nearly a week since that night, and though the immediate chaos had subsided, the echoes of it still lingered in Mia's mind. She moved through her days with a heightened awareness, the memory of Rick's aggression playing on a loop whenever she stepped outside. The knowledge that Jason had stepped in, had fought for her and Noah, brought her some comfort, but it couldn't erase the underlying truth. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that would require more than a single confrontation to address. Jason, meanwhile, had immersed himself in the fight. He had filed formal complaints, sent detailed reports to the DA's office, and even reached out to local advocacy groups to bring attention to the systemic issues exposed by the incident. His days were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and carefully worded statements, and though he carried himself with the same calm authority Mia had always admired, she could see the toll it was taking on him. He barely slept, his mind constantly racing with strategies and contingencies. He was relentless, determined to see this through to the end. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jason finally set his phone down and leaned back against the couch, letting out a long, weary sigh. Mia watched him for a moment before reaching over to take his hand. "You've done so much already," she said softly. "You can't carry this all on your own." Jason turned to her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "I can't stop now," he said. "Not when we're finally making progress. Rick's being investigated, and Miller's actions or lack of them are under review. The department knows they're under a microscope. But if we let up, even for a second, they'll find a way to bury this." Mia nodded, understanding his determination, even as she worried about what it was costing him. "I just don't want you to burn yourself out," she said gently. "You can't fight this fight if you're running on empty." Jason gave her a faint smile, his hand tightening around hers. "I'm not alone in this," he said. "I have you. And Noah. You remind me why this matters, why it's worth it." His voice softened as he added, "I'm fighting for us, for our family, for every family that's been through something like this." Mia felt a lump rise in her throat at his words, and she squeezed his hand in return. "We're in this together," she said. "But don't forget to take care of yourself too. We need you." Jason nodded, his expression softening further. "I will," he promised. "I'll be careful. But I need to see this through." The following day, the first tangible consequences began to emerge. Jason received confirmation that Rick had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. It was a small victory, but one that carried significant weight. For too long, officers like Rick had acted with impunity, shielded by the thin blue line that protected their own. But this time, there would be no shielding, no quiet reassignment to another precinct. The pressure Jason had applied, combined with the undeniable facts of the case, had forced the department to take action. Later that evening, as they sat down for dinner, Jason shared the news with Mia. "Rick's on leave," he said simply, his tone neutral but with a flicker of satisfaction beneath it. "It's not enough, but it's a start." Mia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think it'll lead to real change?" she asked. "Or is this just about damage control?" Jason took a sip of water before answering. It depends on what we do next, he said. If we keep pushing, if we hold them accountable at every turn, we can force change. But it's going to take time. And it's going to take more than just us. Mia understood what he meant. The fight they were waging was bigger than their family, bigger than any single incident. It was about dismantling a system that had been built to protect those in power at the expense of those it was supposed to serve. It was a daunting task, one that sometimes felt overwhelming. But as she looked at Jason, at the quiet determination in his eyes, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next few weeks, the case gained traction. Media coverage brought public attention to the incident, and advocacy groups amplified the story, using it as a rallying cry for police reform. Jason and Mia were approached by community leaders, lawyers, and activists, all eager to support their efforts. What had begun as a personal battle was quickly becoming a broader movement, one that transcended their individual experience. But with the attention came challenges. Jason received backlash from certain corners, accusations that he was anti-police or using the incident for political gain. He handled the criticism with the same calm precision he brought to everything else, refusing to be derailed by baseless attacks. Mia, meanwhile, found herself grappling with a mix of emotions. She was proud of the progress they were making, but she couldn't help feeling exposed, vulnerable in the face of so much scrutiny. She worried about Noah, about how all of this might affect him as he grew older. One night, as they put Noah to bed, Jason noticed the tension in Mia's expression. After tucking their son in, he led her to the couch and sat down beside her, taking her hands in his. "Talk to me," he said gently. "What's on your mind?" Mia hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm proud of what we're doing," she said slowly, "but I can't help feeling tired. Like this fight never ends, and I worry about what it'll mean for Noah. What kind of world are we leaving for him?" Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know," he said softly. "I think about that too. But that's why we're doing this. So he won't have to fight the same battles we're fighting now. So he can grow up in a world that's just a little bit better, a little bit fairer." Mia leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I just want him to be safe," she whispered. "That's all I want." Jason wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "And he will be," he said, "because we won't stop until he is." In the weeks that followed, Jason's efforts began to yield results. Rick was formally charged with misconduct, and the department implemented new training protocols aimed at addressing bias and de-escalation. It was far from a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. And for Mia and Jason, it was proof that change was possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jason turned to Mia and said, "We've come a long way, but there's still so much to do." Mia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "We'll do it together," she said. "For Noah, for all of us." Jason reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Together, he agreed. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and crimson, they sat side by side, united in purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.